This is lecture number DR024US18. This is the 24th of the Mega Genius lectures and the 18th lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 17th, 2000. The title of this lecture is Psychics in the Light. It is 36 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
One of the reasons mankind has such a lack of understanding of present time is that he has such an astounding lack of understanding of his past. Understanding the subject of psychic phenomena, meaning any events not completely explainable by laws of the physical universe, requires a familiarity with at least its recent history. The facts about many pertinent episodes have been misstated, distorted, and suppressed, for there are many who prefer that the truth remain a secret. I'll set the record straight. Please follow me now on this. The public's current intense interest in psychics and psychic phenomena is directly traceable to a specific occurrence on Friday, March 31st, 1848, at about 7 o'clock p.m., in a ramshackle house in Hydesville, New York, 30 miles east of Rochester, New York. Since the dawn of creation, someone somewhere has been hearing curious goings-on in the night, and so did Mrs. John D. Fox that evening. The first indication something unusual was happening had occurred a couple of nights previously, when Mr. and Mrs. Fox, 8-year-old Margaret, and 6-year-old Kate had been aroused by spooky noises. A fruitless investigation was conducted throughout the house by candlelight. The thing that went bump in the night was not very loud, but it did jar the bedsteads and Mrs. Fox's nerves. It was midnight before she got to sleep. On the following evening, March 30, Mrs. Fox heard the noises again, and did not sleep at all that night. Therefore, neither did her husband. They both searched the house again, and noted that when they stood on opposite sides of a door, knocks seemed to come from within it. Other noises were described as resembling footsteps in the pantry. Mrs. Fox concluded, quote, "The house must be haunted by some unhappy, restless spirit," unquote. On March 31st, at sundown, the Fox family retired for the evening. According to his deposition signed later by Mrs. Fox, she was a physical wreck. Yet no sooner had she tucked the children into bed than they began shouting, quote, "Here they come again," unquote. Mrs. Fox scolded the girls and dispensed firm instructions that there would be no more noises or talk about spirits that night. Mr. Fox was still occupied about the house, and so his wife went to bed without further delay. Almost immediately loud knocking started, and Mr. Fox began another investigation of the commotion. While he was shaking the sashes to see if they were rattling in the wind, little Kate noticed that the spirit rapped each time her father jarred the sash. To prove her point, Kate shouted, quote, "Here, old Splitfoot, do as I do," unquote, and snapped her fingers several times. The raps copied. Margaret instructed, quote, "Now do just as I do. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, unquote, clapping her hands each time. 4 raps responded. Then Kate moved her fingers in a silent snapping motion to determine if the spirit could see as well as hear. The correct number of raps again followed. Mrs. Fox then asked the entity to rap out the ages of her 7 children. The reply was accurate, concluding with 3 raps that corresponded with the age of her youngest child, who was deceased. Mrs. Fox questioned the source of the rappings further, and learned she was dealing with a spirit that claimed to have been injured on the premises. It had been a 31-year-old man, with a wife, 2 sons, and 3 daughters, and had been murdered in the Fox home. His body was buried in the cellar, he said, and the murderer was still at large. At his wife's insistence, Mr. Fox invited Mary Redfield, a neighbor, to witness the proceedings. Upon her arrival, the suspicious Mrs. Redfield promised that if a ghost really did exist in the Fox house, she would, quote, "have a spree with it," unquote. Mrs. Fox resumed her questioning of the spirit, and it responded with the same sort of spooky raps. An impressed Mrs. Redfield darted home to get her husband. After Mr. Redfield arrived, his wife dashed to Mrs. Dusler's house with the news. Mrs. Dusler brought her husband, who in turn summoned Mr. and Mrs. Hyde and Mr. and Mrs. Jewell. By 9 o'clock that night, a dozen persons had crowded into the tiny Fox home, although some were too frightened to enter the bedroom. You can imagine the eerie scene, with a restless ghost beating on the walls by flickering candlelight above a slaughtered corpse buried in the cellar. Mrs. Fox continued the questioning, the spirit rapped, and Mr. Dusler felt the bedstead jar. Mr. Dusler then began interrogating the spirit, and learned that the victim had been a peddler who was murdered for the sum of $500. The crime had been committed 5 years before, on a Tuesday, at midnight, in the east bedroom. The murderer, it was revealed, had slashed the sleeping peddler's throat with a butcher knife, dragged his remains through the buttery and down the stairs to the cellar, and buried the body the following night at a depth of 10 feet. By this time curiosity had gotten the better of some men who were fishing in nearby Mud Creek, and they had joined the gathering to see what all the fuss was about. Mr. Dusler sent Mr. Redfield to the cellar with a candle and instructions to pace about. By communicating with the spirit at the same time, Mr. Dusler was able to determine just where the body was buried. Each time Mr. Redfield stood in a particular location, the spirit rapped loudly. Mr. Dusler had already learned the name of the murderer, John C. Bell, a former occupant. Now, as still more neighbors arrived, he recited the alphabet again as the raps revealed the identity of the murder victim, Charles B. Rosma, from Orleans County. At last the seance broke up. Messrs. Fox and Redfield remained in the house all night, but Mrs. Fox, still determined to get some sleep, escaped with her daughters to the Redfields' home. There were no further raps in the Fox house that night. Sensational news travels fast, as Mrs. Fox learned the next morning, when she returned to find that 8 times the population of Hydesville had converged on the tiny dwelling, even though it was April Fool's Day. There were no more raps until sundown, when, with more than 300 persons present, the knockings resumed. Although digging was begun in the cellar that evening, water filled the excavation faster than it could be removed, and the project was temporarily abandoned. On Sunday, the following day, raps were heard for the first time during the morning and afternoon. Dusler, Benjamin Clark, and Stephen Smith asked everyone to leave the bedroom, relocated to the cellar, and asked the deceased Charles B. Rosma if his body was buried there. A single rap seemed to occur above their heads. They searched the bedroom again, but found no one. On Monday morning, several questions were answered by the usual rapping. On Tuesday, Mrs. Fox heard the sounds again. On that day, Mr. E. Lewis, who was investigating the phenomena, helped Mrs. Fox prepare a formal statement outlining the recent events from her point of view. Mr. Fox and a number of other witnesses signed a separate deposition 1 week later, on April 11th. Now that is an accurate summary of the notable events that transpired at the Fox home during those first few days, according to the written statements originated then by those who were present. Further, it is probably the only such account that you will encounter anywhere, for 2 reasons. The first is that most historians have not had the opportunity to study the first-hand testimony. The 22 statements obtained by E. Lewis were published in May of 1848 in Canandaigua, New York, in a 40-page pamphlet titled, quote, "A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of Mr. John D. Fox." Unquote. About 10 years later, a copy was almost impossible to be had. After a century, only 4 copies were known to exist. The second reason is that much fabrication was woven into the sequence of events long ago by those who preferred their versions to the truth. In many instances, facts were ignored altogether. For example, there never was a Charles B. Rosma from Orleans County. In spite of intense efforts to prove the contrary, not the slightest evidence was ever uncovered to indicate that such a murder victim had ever existed, or any of the other 6 members of his alleged family. John C. Bell, who lived in the neighboring town of Lyons, was astonished to hear that he had been accused of a gruesome murder. 44 of his neighbors signed a statement to the effect that he was a man of admirable character, and that they considered the murder allegation to be totally false. Other neighbors were not so sure, and 2 residents of the area recalled that during the summer of 1844, well water near the Bell house had tasted bad. The little Fox home soon became known as the Spook House. Further digging in the cellar did not uncover anything of importance, but the rappings continued, and Mrs. Fox's hair reportedly turned white within a week. Whatever was going on in the house, she wanted out. Before the end of the month, she packed up her family and moved into the nearby home of her son, David Fox. As if cursed, the rappings followed. It now became evident that little Margaret and Kate were intimately associated with, if not the sources of, the noises. Mrs. Fox decided to separate the girls and sent Kate to the home of a married daughter, Leah Fish, in Rochester. No sooner had Kate arrived than Leah announced that dishes, blankets, and all sorts of objects had begun floating about her house to the accompaniment of the usual raps, spirit groans, and disembodied hollering. Once Leah even heard coagulated blood being poured from a bucket. Or so she claimed. Meanwhile, at the David Fox home, rappings continued in the presence of Margaret. Leah wanted to take her in too. As soon as this was done, the girl's older sister assumed management of their affairs and arranged for them to begin giving seances. By this time, Margaret and Kate had supposedly developed the ability to communicate with an array of departed friends and relatives. Those who attended the seances claimed that tables and chairs skated about the room, a guitar hovered overhead, and hair combs hopped about from the heads of ladies. Other citizens of Rochester and nearby towns were also beginning to hear spirit raps in their houses, and some were certain they had established direct contact with the Holy Ghost. By this time, some of the people of Rochester had decided a much more thorough investigation was overdue. A committee of 5 held a private seance with the sisters on November 15, 1849, and reported its findings that evening. The members noted that replies to some of their questions were inaccurate. However, they had been unable to determine just how the raps had been produced. A second committee met with the girls on the following day, and concluded that the raps had not been produced by either machinery or ventriloquism. A third committee was selected to investigate them the next day. One of the members swore that if he failed to discover how the children were making the sounds, he would hurl himself over the falls of the Genesee River. Nevertheless, when the seance was over, the committee reported that the secret was as secure as ever. Subsequently, some of the assembled citizens became so enraged at the announcement that a nasty riot ensued, during which there was talk of lynching the girls. Fortunately, they were whisked to safety. In February of 1850, Leah took the girls to Albany, New York, where they conducted seances for the remarkably steep price of $5 per sitting. But then it was the spirits who had stipulated those fees. Leah, who pocketed the money, said, "The Rochester knockers, as they were sometimes called, were able to effect raps that seemed to originate from beneath a floor, within a sofa, and on a door, as witnessed by author James Fenimore Cooper, poet William Cullen Bryant, and journalist and politician Horace Greeley, among others of distinction. In fact, the sounds were heard to come from whatever surface or location spectators placed their attention upon. Many, however, considered this phenomenon imaginary. Sometimes the sisters were able to cause spirit raps that reflected ages, dates, and other bits of information that Margaret and Kate supposedly could not possibly have known, but at other times the spirits' replies were obviously inaccurate. In early 1851, the Fox sisters were investigated by 3 physicians from the University of Buffalo School of Medicine. According to their findings, the rapping was produced by, quote, one or more of the movable articulations of the skeleton, unquote. The Rochester knockers, they concluded, were the Rochester impostors. Although the sisters did not deny that their secret had been discovered, Leah and Margaret attempted to counter the unfavorable publicity by challenging the committee to prove its theory at a subsequent seance. The physicians accepted. During the second phase of the investigation, as during the gentleman's previous encounter with the sisters, only Leah and Margaret were present. The raps commenced immediately and energetically, until the physicians placed their hands on Margaret's knees. Abruptly, the rapping ceased. When the hands were removed, the rapping began again. When the hands drew near, there was silence, for as long as an hour. After some 4 hours of this hocus-pocus, the seance ended with 11-year-old Margaret in tears and the physicians confident they were dealing with outright fraud. They concluded that the spirit raps were produced by Margaret snapping her knee joints. This hypothesis was soon refined by a clergyman, Dr. Potts, and later by 2 brothers, Heman and C. Chauncey Burr, who proposed that the girls simply snap their toes. Furthermore, the three men publicly demonstrated their abilities to do the same. On April 17, 1851, Mrs. Norman Culver, a relative of the Fox sisters, stated that 9-year-old Kate had privately confessed that the theory was true. Other investigations of the Fox sisters were conducted through the years, including one by a committee of professors from Harvard University and another by the University of Pennsylvania's Seibert Commission. Fraud was suspected in both cases, but it was neither proved nor disproved due to the girls' inability or unwillingness to produce spirit raps under controlled conditions. The Fox sisters' fame had spread early to England and Europe, but they spent the next several decades conducting a broad tour of the United States, grossing well over $100 per night. Sometimes they performed together, sometimes individually, but always with the cooperation of the spirit world for the proper fee. In 1871, Kate journeyed to England with her expanded repertoire, which included spirit lights, the materialization of spirit hands, and table levitations. In 1876, she was joined by Margaret Fox Kane, and they operated successfully there until the 1880s. In August of 1888, 40 years after the birth of modern spiritualism, it was rumored that Margaret had decided to blow the lid off the movement. Meanwhile, in New York, she was guarded day and night to prevent her from being kidnapped by mediums who stood to lose greatly by an expose. On October 21, Margaret Fox Kane's signed confession was released by the New York World. No one had ever said it more believably than one of the Fox sisters. No one else could have. It all began, Margaret said, when she and Katie were very young and mischievous children. After they had gone to bed one night, they discovered they could easily frighten their mother by tying a string to an apple and bouncing it against the floor to make strange noises. Because they were so young, they were never suspected by their mother. Instead, Mrs. Fox anxiously inquired, quote, "Is this a disembodied spirit that has taken possession of my dear children?" unquote, which encouraged them all the more. When the neighbors began to arrive, the girls found it too difficult to continue the apple trick, so they devised a covert technique of rapping on the bedstead. As soon as it was alleged that someone had been killed in the house by a former occupant, Margaret continued, quote, "Poor Mr. Bell was shunned and looked upon by the whole community as a murderer," unquote. Leah had purposefully led the youngsters on, and it was while they were under her care that Katie perfected the subtle method of producing spirit raps. Margaret revealed, like most perplexing things, when made clear, it is astonishing how easily it is done, unquote. Soon the sisters began attracting immense crowds. Many spectators were convinced by the very first little rap that ghosts were communicating, she said. Quote, "We knew when to rap yes or no, according to certain signs Mrs. Leah Underhill gave us during the seance," unquote, she said. A delusion common to many persons, she added, was to imagine during the rapping that spirits were touching them. Although she had tried some 30 years previously to reform her fraudulent way of life, Margaret said, she had been driven back to it by financial necessity and by the insistence of Leah, who had wanted to establish a new religion. But now, having thought about exposing spiritualism for many years, she had come to a determination. She confessed, quote, "I have seen so much miserable deception. Every morning of my life I have it before me. When I wake up, I brood over it. That is why I am willing to state that spiritualism is a fraud of the worst deception," unquote. Her life, she proclaimed, had been one of sorrow. Margaret asserted, quote, "I want to see the day when it is entirely done away with. After my sister Katie and I expose it, I hope spiritualism will be given a death blow. If I cannot do it, who can? I who have been the beginning of it. At least I hope to reduce the ranks of the 8 million spiritualists in the country. I go into it as a holy war. I am waiting anxiously and fearlessly for the moment when I can show the world, by personal demonstration, that all spiritualism is a fraud and deception," unquote. She concluded, quote, "I trust that this statement, coming solemnly from me, the first and the most successful in this deception, will break the rapid growth of spiritualism and prove that it is all a fraud, hypocrisy, and delusion," unquote. That fateful evening, more than 2,000 persons jammed into the New York Academy of Music to witness Margaret's final act of summoning the spirit world. Kate Fox Jenkins was there too, but the moment was Margaret's. She removed her right shoe, set her foot upon a simple wooden stool, and called upon the spirits to make their presence known. Rap, rap, rap. 3 physicians examined Margaret's foot during her revelation of the Fox sisters' secret, and immediately agreed that the raps were produced by an almost imperceptible action of the first joint of her large toe. Margaret confirmed that this was so. For almost half a century, people had argued their theories about the source of those startling sounds. Now, suddenly, the mystery that had held generations captive had vanished like a vampire at dawn. The mother of fraudulent spiritualism had forthrightly laid her errant child to rest. Kate went into seclusion while Margaret repeated her demonstration throughout the United States. Yet there was no future or profit in continually revealing a secret that had become public knowledge, as Margaret soon discovered. The following year, financially destitute and plagued by alcoholism, she attempted to retract her confessions and proclaimed her intention to return to the only livelihood she had ever known. Accordingly, since the truth about the spirit raps was widely known, she could no longer give seances nor produce spirit raps. Rather, she said, she would conduct a lecture tour extolling the genuineness of spirit raps in return for what she called, quote, the maintenance of life, unquote. Once duped, the public would not be betrayed again, at least not by the Fox sisters. Their remaining years were filled with gloom, and before the turn of the century, death had claimed both Margaret and Kate Fox, 2 of the most famous psychics our world has ever known. Margaret Fox's public confession stunned the spiritualistic movement, but did not deliver the death blow as she had so fervently hoped. No sooner had the shenanigans begun in the little Fox house in 1848 than spooks began pounding on the floors, walls, and ceilings of hundreds of other homes throughout the United States and Europe. By the time of the sisters' confession, thousands of other enterprising mediums had discovered the possibilities of vast financial reward within the realm of psychic phenomena, and unhesitatingly reasserted their own trustworthiness. The pervasive and tangled roots of modern spiritualism had already coursed too deeply to be unearthed easily, even by the children who had sown the deceptive seed. Another of the most renowned psychics of that era was Daniel Douglas Home, who could produce not only spirit raps and spirit hands, supposedly formed by ghostly hands dipping into hot paraffin, but complete spirit forms. He could wash his face with red-hot coals, elongate his body more than 18 inches, and cause an accordion to float melodically about the heads of spectators. Sometimes he would sail to the ceiling like a fly, where he would doodle on the plaster before gliding back into his chair. On a whim, he just might rocket through an open window. Furthermore, Mr. Home neither extinguished the lights during his exhibitions nor accepted money for his services. Or so it is said. Regardless, these allegations constitute the highlights of his career as it is still being reported, but the portrait looks quite different with a frame of truth. In Connecticut, in 1850, shortly after the Fox sisters burst into prominence, the house that Holmes shared with his aunt also became infested with spirit raps. Apparently the aunt was not the source, but she must have had a good idea who was, for when the 17-year-old Holmes announced his intention to cash in on the matter, she caused a chair to rise into the air and fly toward him in a manner easily understood by both of them. The claim that Holmes never received fees for his performances is exceptionally misleading, if not blatantly false. His spirits had a marvelous knack for suggesting that he be lavished with gifts of appreciation. Naturally, they used Holmes' own vocal cords to make those wishes known. One revealing incident occurred during Holmes' visit to the palace of the Russian Tsar. An impressive array of emeralds was loaned to him for the purpose of a successful seance. In short order, however, they were dematerialized by the spirits, who, always with an eye to the psychic's finances, refused to materialize them. Considering Holmes' insistence that the spirits could not be determined against their wishes, his gracious host was unwilling to press the matter further. But the police chief was suspicious. He had Holmes seized and searched. Well, apparently the spirits decided to materialize the jewels after all, for they were found hiding in a secret pocket in Holmes' coat tail. Those naughty little spooks. At the determination of the police chief, Holmes vanished from Petrograd like a spirit in the night. As for the claim that Home never extinguished the lights during his demonstrations, the statement is pure fabrication. The records are clear that most of his seances were conducted in varying degrees of darkness. It's alleged that, quote, he showed his powers in all lights, unquote. Well, he certainly did not show all of his powers in the light, far from it, and the greater the darkness, the more impressive his tricks became. On one occasion, in London, Home conducted a seance for the English poet Robert Browning, during which the lighting was minimal. With that advantage, Home managed to materialize the face of Browning's deceased infant son. I consider that to have been Holmes' most remarkable feat, and I suspect that Browning did too, since the poet had not lost an infant son. Taking advantage of the darkness himself, Browning pounced upon the apparition and discovered the purported baby's face to be Mr. Holmes barefoot. The poetess, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert's wife, had placed considerable trust in the psychic until that illuminating moment. Later, Mr. Browning wrote a particularly unflattering poem about Home called Mr. Sludge, Medium. Now, in 1866, at the age of 33, Home caused a knot to mysteriously appear in a handkerchief that belonged to Jane Lyon, a 75-year-old widow, and convinced her that the spirits would look favorably upon her if she gave 24,000 pounds sterling to this medium, who never charged a fee. The money was subsequently offered, and Home promptly accepted. Home soon burned the widow's will, and induced her to cross his palm with another 6,000 pounds sterling. Then the spirit of Mrs. Lyon's husband persuaded her to adopt Home as her beloved son, and provide him with an allowance of 700 pounds sterling per year. Then Home obtained a mortgage from her, amounting to another 30,000 pounds sterling. Now, about that time, Mrs. Lyon had considerable difficulty explaining to her lawyer what had happened to half of her estate, and that the spirit of her deceased husband was fully in control of her financial affairs. Home was arrested, tried, and ordered by the court to make restitution to Mrs. Lyon, as the transfer of the funds and deed had been accomplished by fraud. And you should not be surprised to learn that Kate Fox sometimes performed with Home in her later years. His repertoire was much more diversified than hers, although I find no logic between Holmes' talent for licking a hot coal with his tongue, or elongating his body by 18 inches, and proof that the spirits can communicate after death. Of course, Holmes' body usually appeared to only lengthen by about half that amount. For Kate Fox's husband, it stretched even further. Many consider Holmes' levitations to have been his most impressive feats, based in part on the claim by Sir William Crookes, the English physicist and chemist, that there exist, quote, at least 100 recorded instances of Mr. Home rising from the ground in the presence of as many separate persons, unquote. Well, it's unfortunate that Crookes did not count them before making that assertion, for there are really only about 33 recorded instances, and many of them occurred before the same persons. Furthermore, they all took place in darkness, with the exception of one that happened in full view and bright daylight. Unfortunately, the only witness on that occasion was Mr. Home. By far the most famous of Holmes' levitations occurred December 13th, 1868, before Lord Adair, the Master of Lindsay, and Captain Charles Wine, a respectable but small audience. The location was the bedroom on the 3rd floor of Ashley House, Lord Adair's London residence. Now, according to the version still being touted as proof today, Home became entranced, walked down the hall to the sitting room, raised the window, and shot out into space. Some 70 feet above the ground, he revolved end over end as spirit hands wafted him through the air to the vicinity of the bedroom window, where he hovered in full view of the witnesses. Home then raised that window, stepped inside, and soon awoke from his trance and was told of his remarkable levitation. It's particularly notable that there was no supporting structure between the two windows. The levitation occurred in the light, and the 3 witnesses actually saw Home float from window to window. It's all fabulously intriguing, as long as you do not examine the facts. Actually, there were supporting structures that ran between the windows, and a small balcony outside each, according to a written account by Lord Adair. He should have known. It was his house. In another written account, Adair stated that it was too dark to see clearly, and that they did not actually see home wafted from window to window, which was a distance of less than 7.5 feet. According to the Master of Lindsay's version, all that he was able to see was a momentary shadow of home on the wall just before the medium stepped back into the bedroom due to the moonlight. Yet if you check the astronomical records for London on that date, you will find that it was the night of a new moon. In other words, the moon reflected no light at all. By Captain Wine's account, he could only swear, quote, that home went out of one window and came in at the other window, unquote. And that is the only significant datum agreed upon by the three witnesses. Only one person could testify that he actually saw Home levitating, and that person was, of course, Home himself. D. Home, often called the most renowned 19th century spiritualist, is often cited to this day as proof of psychic phenomena. I can only add that none of his psychic effects are the slightest mystery to me, and therefore neither is Daniel Douglas Home. The beginning of the 20th century coincided with the rapid rise to fame of Eusapia Palladino, an Italian peasant who discovered her own psychic powers as a child of 13, just after a visit to her country by D. Home. Not only did mediumship prove to be a road to wealth for Palladino, but she probably holds the distinction of having bamboozled more great scientific minds than any psychic in recent history. By the time she came to the United States in 1908, her reputation was international. In her typical routine, Palladino and a small group of spectators would be seated about a table under fairly reasonable lighting conditions. The medium would place her right foot upon the foot of the spectator to her right, and her left foot upon the foot of the person to her left, as a guarantee that her feet could not be used to produce phony psychic effects. Then everyone would be asked to join hands, forming a chain upon the tabletop, and the seance would begin. In brief, tiny spirit raps would soon occur, followed by a series of loud spirit raps, and shortly by a dramatic wobbling and rocking of the table. With Palladino's hands in full view, the table would then rise spectacularly into the air and float for several seconds within the circle of participants before dropping to the floor abruptly. Distinguished scientists, professors, and investigators of the supernatural in Italy, France, and England were at a loss to understand how a single human being could produce such miraculous manifestations. So they promptly declared the events to be authentic psychic phenomena. In New York, a group of professors from Columbia University arranged for a series of 10 seances with Palladino at $125 per sitting. After 8 of their performances had been held, they were unable to conceive an explanation for the wonders that they had repeatedly witnessed with their own eyes. On the basis that it takes a trickster to catch a trickster, one of the scientists secretly enlisted the aid of a reformed medium to help him and his colleagues effect a full exposure. The ex-medium agreed on the condition that the other scientists would be replaced by magicians who would be introduced to Palladino as college professors at the next seance. In addition, they concocted a scheme to smuggle 2 spies into the seance, another magician and a student at Columbia, who would hide under the table and watch Palladino's feet. Never before had the odds been so even. At the next seance, everyone was introduced. The ex-medium and a magician were seated flanking Palladino, and the spies secretly crawled into place. She placed her feet on top of those of the gentlemen next to her, clasped their hands in hers, and called upon the spirits to make their presence known. Palladino then withdrew her hands from the chain, and almost immediately tiny spirit raps were heard, which she appeared to cause by hiding her thumbs under her palms, pressing them against the tabletop, and sliding them with barely perceptible movements. To mask these manipulations, she intermittently beat the air with her fists. Apparently the spirits needed to be riled. Meanwhile, under the table, the real performance was just beginning. During her convulsive motions, the spies saw her slide her right foot forward a few inches so that her right heel pressed on the magician's toes, and then twist her foot so that her right toes came to rest upon those of the ex-medium to her left. In other words, she manipulated her right foot to do the work of 2. Now this trick enabled her to completely free her left foot. To accomplish this, she had to begin the seance with her feet fairly close together, but that was why she brought her own table. constructed to her specifications, and sat at its narrow end. Now the loud spirit raps began, as the unsuspecting Palladino kicked the table leg with her free left foot. Then, as she rocked the table with her hands, she slid her toes under the table leg to her immediate left, pressed the ex mediumus palm against the table top directly above it, under the pretext of trying to stop the motion, and hiked the table straight into the air with her foot. It was all so simple, and oh so fraudulent. After the psychic demonstration had concluded, and the magicians had all pretended to be duly impressed, Palladino proclaimed that the seance was one of her most successful. During the following decade, Eusapia Palladino was exposed repeatedly. Yet many of the great minds of the time, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who intrigued the world with his authorship of Sherlock Holmes' deductive reasoning, continued to believe passionately in the genuineness of Palladino, D.D. Home, and many other frauds. In her later years, however, Palladino was forced to admit what she could no longer rationally refute. Before her death in 1918, she confessed to several methods by which she produced spirit raps, 4 by which she could free a controlled foot, and 6 ways of levitating a table. Since then, many psychic investigators have directly referenced the validity of Palladino's supposedly supernatural powers, but Eusapia understood the truth of her profession best. She revealed, quote, all mediums indulge in tricks. All. Unquote. In the next lecture, we will investigate the greatest psychic investigator of them all, Houdini.